Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
Hi, I'm Pavan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. June 5th is World Environment Day, and this year, our first on BIC Talks, we want to think about cities and the environment. Joining us to talk about how to rewild our cities, we have Dr. Harini Nagendra, Professor of Sustainability at Azim Premji University and the author of several books on cities and the environment. Harini, welcome to BIC Talks.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Also with me is Raghu Tenkayala of the Bangalore International Centre. Hi, Raghu.
Hi, Pavan.
So, Harini, I want to start by getting this question out of the way. You might find this annoying, but permit me. A lot of the times we talk about development, and cities are, of course, at the heart of a lot of development thinking. Cities are our engines of growth, of employment, and of so much more. So, when we start talking about the environment and conservation efforts, why does this get framed as anti-development? Is it anti-development?
So that beats me too. But the thing is, how can environment in cities be anti-development? Because we need clean air to breathe. We need, clean water to drink. We need the sight of greenery just to lift our spirits, because living in cities is hard business. How would you live in a city which is extremely polluted, where the air is bad, where the water is bad, where there's no greenery in sight, where there's no place to do open air exercises, no place to connect with nature? How would you live in a place like that? That's not a place of well-being. So to me, it's sort of automatic that because you have so many people in cities, nature becomes even more important in cities in some sense than it is outside. Even if you think of a purely human-focused way, just to keep those people alive and healthy and happy. So I don't see any way in which thinking of the environment in cities is anti-development. In fact, it's pro-people.
Thanks, Harini. But even beyond this human-centric focused, is there value for the environment within our cities?
So I think if you look at it, there are so much more than just the regular value. There are beauties of imagination you get. Opportunities of thinking differently in cities, opportunities of connecting with the fact that we share our world with so many different kinds of beings that are not all human, right? Which I think is a very fundamental aspect that many people in rural areas, many people in forests have a very sort of intimate understanding of the fact that we share our world with so many other kinds of living beings. It's a very spiritual kind of way of living. And I don't mean religious in the formal religious sense, but it's just a very transcendental way of thinking about the world. And I think in cities, we tend to be so focused on just the mechanics of daily life that we tend to forget that. And I think it's very important also to have nature in the city to help us think differently and invite our imagination to encompass all of this life.
Thanks, Harini. So, World Environment Day comes once a year. There are 364 days in between, and we've seen them come and go every year, right? So, if you look at the last 5 years or so, how have you seen any kind of environmental efforts that have happened at the city scale, be it in Bangalore or be it across the country?
The first, I think the big negatives is that our city governments have largely failed us. And this is true in India, but this is also true, unfortunately, across the world in focusing on any aspects of nature sufficiently. They focus so much on roads, infrastructure, buildings, flyovers, metros, all of which are essential to the city. But nature is just completely ignored in this whole process. I mean, if you take Bengaluru Lake, I think that is one excellent example of how dysfunctional we are. Or you take all the ghost trees, which were supposed to have been planted as compensatory afforestation for all these projects that have taken place in Bangalore for the past 20 years. Where are these trees? I think of them as ghost trees because they simply don't exist anywhere. So if you take some of these ideas, you realize how bad our planning is. So that's, I think, on the government front, on the municipalities front, on the state and national front, I think it's just completely failed. On the positives, I think you find huge amount of community effort that is slowly beginning to take shape. So there was civic action of various kinds. There were always civic protests. There were groups of various kinds in different cities that were naturalist groups. But now you see them coalescing to some extent. People from Delhi speak to people from Chennai, who speak to people from Bangalore, etc. People in PILs against the state asking, petitioning for more trees or better lakes, etc. Share their research, share their resources, share their ways of thinking. People who are involved in planting or lake restoration put out guides from which help one city to another. So I think there's this networking of community action, which to me is very positive. I think that is where you can get some scale to have influence. Because otherwise it's one community and one lake, or one community and its set of trees that it's planted. It's only when you get this coalescing of efforts that you can actually hopefully get the state to respond.
Thank you. So basically, this means that there are now processes outside of government which might be able to push governments to do slightly better things in our cities, right? Even then, the size of solution and the scale of the solution is much, much smaller than the scale of the problem.
Absolutely. And there's so many things communities simply can't do. I mean, how would a community reduce air pollution in a city? Simply not possible, right?
And this community also involves people who are driving cars and bikes and other things as well, right? I mean, community is not divorced from individuals who are going about their lives.
Absolutely. I mean, I would absolutely love to take public transport every day, but for that, I need to have active, viable public transport to my office, to my workplace, right? Which gets me there in a reasonable amount of time and which gets me back in a reasonable amount of time. And when I say I, it's not me personally, but I think most of us. But so unless you get that system fixed, I think we often reduce a lot of these into people need to do more. People need to take their shopping bags. People need to take public transport. But the system needs to favor all of this. And that, I think, is really where we can have these community piecemeal efforts. But where is this, as you say, the scale of the problem is so huge.
Harini, I had a question here. Given that there's so many of these amazing community efforts and with restoring various lakes and parks and all of that, how much is that is scientific? Because, the question I ask is because even today there is no accessible manual on urbanizing, greening for urban areas. What are the plants that need to be planted? Even the government plants these topiary hedges now, like, in these sort of main roads, right? Replacing. How much of a value are we adding with these kinds of initiatives? And how do we move towards an effort where, what we're doing counts for something, and just not just a sort of spending exercise for the government?
Yeah. Or I think an exercise in generating a sense of fulfillment for communities also. I see the point completely, because there are so many well-meaning efforts at planting, and they plant the completely wrong kinds of trees and species, right? So all this eucalyptus that you see on lake beds, why is there so much eucalyptus on lake beds when you know that this is not the right kind of tree to plant? Or as you say, these hedges and these ornamental ficus trees, which are going to grow very large, stuffed into this narrow median in the center of the road.
Yes, absolutely.
I think there are many problems. One is the problem that you were talking about, which is the state spending money. The time that you saw a lot of these ficus trees stuffed into the medians in the center of Bangalore roads was apparently an exercise because somebody who was purchasing trees in the government had a contract with a nursery that was supplying these at ridiculously inflated prices. So 15 years ago, it was 300 rupees for one of these saplings. There's a story I heard. I mean, I can't verify it one way or the other. There's a lot of money to be made in plant. So you plant the wrong kinds of species, ornamental species, because there's so much money. Whereas if you planted a mango or a jamun or something, it would be cheaper. So it's not worth doing it economically. To look at the political economy of these. That said, I think the other larger problem is there that we think one tree is just the same as the other tree. We're not thinking in terms of ecosystems. We're not thinking in terms of, when we say rewilding our cities, coming back to the topic of this conversation, a wild place is a place that ecosystems, there are processes. If there's a tree is not just a tree. It has a canopy. There are birds that sit on it. There are butterflies that take the nectar. There are people that maybe harvest the berries, make oil from the honge tree, or people who take the neem and cook with drumstick leaves. There's so much in that ecosystem. There are people, there are species of various other kinds. There's a canopy. There are roots that reduce the runoff of water. There are leaves that clean up the polluted air. All of these processes are going on. And that is really clearly why one tree is not another tree. What trees are you planting? How are you cleaning up your lakes? Are you converting what was a lake with a very, muddy slope and a wetland around it into a place that has a boating jetty and a number of lights at night so people can, and a parking place so people can come and look at water? I'll give you one sort of very classic example. There was a person who came and talked to me, very well-intentioned, part of a lake community cleanup group near Bangalore. And he said, there are a lot of water weeds and they have foam coming up, but he essentially wanted to come to get advice on what machine can pull out these water weeds from the lake. So thing was, I was trying to tell him that you need these water weeds because they're keeping the foam down. Otherwise, your lake would become another Belandur lake. But it kept coming back to the fact that the people who are walking around the lake want to see clean water. So to my mind, are they looking at a bathtub that they want to walk around at one extreme, or are they looking at a healthy functioning lake, which has some mud, it has some algae, it has a mess. Nature's messy.
So, how should we think about the idea of rewilding? Because, this is an urban jungle as well. Cities like Bangalore need to house tens of millions of people. And given that our problems are so much bigger than our solutions right now, do you think there is a space for, these bhags, right? Big, hairy, audacious goals that we need to keep in our minds such that we can make our way there, even muddle our way there?
I think the first thing we need, which we've needed desperately for a long time, is a million trees planting program. US, Europe, various Latin American cities have been doing this for so long, million trees programs. Where's the million trees Bengaluru program?
But I'm sure a million saplings would have been planted every few years, right?
They may have. I'm really skeptical also about these saplings that have been planted. I think at the most you might have these seed balling programs where they just throw a number of seeds in a place and assume that they'll sprout on their own.
So it's a million seeds program rather than a million trees program at best.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if we have something like this, a million new trees in Bangalore, what would that look like? Can you walk us through it? Because it escapes our imagination. We can think of, 100 more kilometers of roads of this nature. We can think of 10-kilometer stretch of an elevated expressway. We don't know how to think about a million trees.
I think we need to then start thinking very innovatively. So if you look at all the medians, they should have smaller kinds of trees where, the medians are on roads. If you're thinking of widening trees, we widen them so that we leave the trees on the side of the road, but make that a median. That's been done in places like Sarjapura, for instance. And then in the Koramangala areas, the roads that were widened, just the trees became another median in the center of another set of lanes. So that is one part of it. Leave the trees where they are, so don't cut them. And where do you plant? I think there's so many places to plant all around lake bunds, all across corporate campuses. Why do we need these lawns and all these corporate campuses? It completely beats me. Academic institutions of various kinds. Look at the older institutions. Look at Indian Institute of Science. Look at GKVK campus. Look at Mount Carmel's College. All of these places have just full of trees. Look at St. John's, for instance, completely full of trees. But you look at all the new schools that you have. No, they have these very landscaped, again, manicured lawns, So you need to have so much place in all these international school campuses, these college campuses, corporate campuses. Then come to schools, Anganwadis, government schools. There you should be having things like drumstick or the agase, which kids can use and eat. Drumstick is supposed to be this magical tree full of, the world is now rediscovering the drumstick. You should have these drumstick trees and those leaves going into whatever midday meals are being planted. Apartments. Again, why do you have so much manicured space? Why can't you have fruiting trees? And then everybody in that apartment eats that fruit. Parks. Why can't we have that look more like the M.N. Krishnarao Park in Baswangudi, for instance, full of trees? Why do we need all lawns? So I think to me, first thing is all the lawns would just go, especially the lawns which have these Mexican grass and all kinds of other turf grasses, and be replaced by trees. And especially fruiting trees do another thing, right? It increases our nutritional security, and especially it decreases the food miles. Therefore, it makes your city more carbon efficient. And if you can figure out a way that low-income communities can actually harvest this fruit and eat from it. So slums, if you plant them full of trees, like again, the drumstick or fruiting trees, which they used to be. So there was a planting program in the 80s, which really covered a lot of the Bangalore low-income settlements with drumstick. So we need to think of these million tree planting programs as multifunctional.
So therefore, trees are not just shade-giving, they're not just ornate, they have functions that are interlinked with all parts of our lives. So what about this roadside tree? This footpath has become one of the most contested spaces in our city, like in all cities, I think, across the country, right? We need it for walking. We need it. Now there is a lane for cycling. We need it for street vendors. We need it for so many functions. And there's this tree, and we are recording this where just in the last month, several hundred trees have fallen because of the rains. So how do we get trees back into our footpaths or along them, and where do we find the space for them?
So let's first look at why do trees fall during the rain. I think a lot of it is the wrong kinds of species that we planted. So the gulmohars will fall, the copper pods will fall, But if you had planted rain trees, if you had planted mango, if you had planted old trees that you found along roadsides, tamarind, mango, jackfruit, they don't fall very easily. So we're planting the wrong kinds of trees. We have to plant certain kinds of trees that we know are hardy and will survive over long times on roads. I mean, India has been planting trees on the roadsides for thousands of years. So we definitely have that knowledge. The second thing is, how do you maintain these trees? For instance, you dig a pit and you put about 4 feet into the ground a wire around it, like a wire cage. And then you lower this tree into that. So what happens is the roots go below that wire cage before they start spreading out into the ground. And so they don't lift up the pavement. They don't lift up or interfere with any underground drains or underground plumbing or electricity wires, phone cables, whatever it is. So there are ways of using, I'll call this technology for simplicity. This is not really technology, but modern ways of thinking of how to fix a tree on the road, but yet keep space for people to move around. It's definitely not difficult. We did this very interesting study with street vendors in Hyderabad. And Hyderabad is obviously a really hot city. The one word that they used for trees constantly was sukoon. And it's such a powerful word. They said, if you have a tree, you know the sukoon of life. And if you don't have a tree, you don't know the sukoon of life. And they would say things like, when I got thrown out of my house and I was homeless, I stayed with my wife and child under this tree. This tree is my house. Or I inherited this tree from my father. And then you find that it's the women, the young migrants, they're the ones who don't have access to a tree. And they say things very fatalistically, like, it's not in everyone's life that the blessing of a tree is found. So I think even for street vendors and for customers that are standing there, for people who walk on the road, everybody needs that tree. Yes, you have to make space for that tree, but it's because they have that tree that they can actually walk there in summer or sell their white stuff on the road.
Thanks, Harini. So, but even there's so little space, right? And real estate prices are always going through the roof. So, are there any new solutions for sort of incentivizing people to really plant more trees in private spaces as well? Because we often talk about the trees that are lost from our public spaces. What we don't talk about as often is how many trees have been lost from private properties in Bangalore over the last 2 decades. Classic thing would be to have 2 trees in a backyard. Now there's, a 3-story house. The trees have been lopped off because every square foot has a very, very high price associated with it.
True. I think there are 2-3 things we can think of there, because you see that trees are being lost from private lots, but these lawns, and I know I keep ranting about lawns, but lawns still seem to be around everywhere. So why can't a tree take the place of a lawn? I think people are very scared about things like insects will come or bats will come. Now the latest obsession about bats. And, so they're very worried about, a lawn is clean and neat and you can mow it and keep it looking green through the year. So again, it's our imagination of neatness versus messiness. I think there is space for this. The second thing I think we need to be thinking of is, what about trees on the rooftop? Certain kinds of trees you put in large pots, or even these large cans and all kinds of other things that you can do. You look at Kerala, so many people grow papayas and bananas on the roof. So why can't we think of certain kinds of things that we can grow on the roof? And that also cools your roof down. So it reduces your air conditioning bills, keeps your house more clean, again gives you fresh food that you know what's gone into that food that you eat. I think we need to be thinking differently about our trees.
So this brings me to my next question, right? When we've been talking quite a bit about trees, and I think trees anchor the idea of the environment when we think about our cities, right? Perhaps the second anchor would be a lake, one being green, the other being blue, the source of water. And these two colors, we really need a lot more of it in our city, if nothing else. How do we think about fauna? How do we think about the role of these moving animals with their own wills amongst all of us who are moving with our own will?
Yeah, I think again it comes back to that point of making space for all of this. You learn so much about life, or whether you call it science or life lessons, by just having something that is beyond just the green and the blue, but something that is a healthy functioning ecosystem. So I remember being very struck. Kaikondrelli Lake near my house has this large grove of eucalyptus. Now, as an ecologist, I find that eucalyptus grove very frustrating because it's the wrong ecosystem for the lake. But there was an 8-year-old girl once walking with her parents, and she ran ahead, came to the grove and ran back quick. And they asked her what happened, and she said, "No, I'm worried there might be a tiger in there. It looks very wild." So you see that here's a child growing up who does not realize that in a eucalyptus grove in the heart of the city, you will not have a tiger. It's not a forest just because there's a whole lot of trees. it's not that child, but there's a whole host of children in the city who don't know what it is to look at a bird or to understand where milk comes from or where nectar comes from or why frogs are so important for us or why pollination is so important to keep the web of life going. None of these very basic ideas that people would know living in a rural area, because you see all these animals around you. You don't know in the city. So I think that, again, for that though, you need a healthy functioning lake, which means also the wetland behind the lake. Our lakes are now just pockets of water. I mean, like large bathtubs, frankly, is what people think of them, with a nice jogging track. It should look neat. And if they could put chlorine in it, they would put chlorine in it.
So then the lake becomes this hub for a lot of the fauna that we can imagine in our city.
Exactly. So we've been doing some interesting studies looking at the eBird data and trying to see what kinds of species, water species, are in the city these days. And you find several have disappeared. There are actually some that are increased in the city over time. And that's the characteristic sort of, I think, feature of the fact that we have actually in Bangalore been able to restore a lot of lakes in recent years. And so that's a plus point. You see certain species, cormorants are back, spot-billed ducks are back, pelicans are back. I know in near my house, all these lakes, painted storks are back definitely in Mahadevpura. And they're a gorgeous sight to see. I mean, you see painted storks, you don't need to see a Monet painting. Just have it in front of you. So these kinds of things are completely different. I mean, the way that one of the I found most memorable about walking on Kaikondrelli Lake was seeing a Brahmini kite swoop into the water, pick up a snake, wriggling in its beak, take an island to feast on it. I mean, just a memorable sight that you sense chills through my spine even now thinking about it. And that you can see it in the heart of the city is just it's magic in the spot of the city. So I think that is what a functioning ecosystem is. It's a spot of magic in a city.
And when this doesn't exist, we are left with pigeons and rats and only the vestiges of the animal world, which are more of a menace for us rather than a source of wonder or beauty.
Exactly. It's just a boring, I mean, there's gray landscape around you and there's a gray imagination with you.
Harini, so we've been talking about how beyond utilitarianism, the idea of these living ecosystems, the wild parts of our cities being linked to our human lives as well, right? But again, sometimes these have been viewed in negative ways. There are lakes, but there's someone fishing on the lake and making a living off of it. You have mango trees near your house. There are people who will come and pluck the mangoes and go away with it. But is there a way we should be thinking about how we can use some of the byproducts of the nature that can be there in ours?
Absolutely. I think this comes back to the whole idea of these wild cities. We did this very interesting study recently because when we walk through Bangalore, and I'm sure all of you who walk through Bangalore would have seen this, you'll see sites like somebody picking up the honge seeds which have fallen on the roadside because they're selling them to a place to make oil, or somebody plucking a neem, those kinds of things. So we were very curious to know, what do people actually harvest and use from this city on a daily basis from wild spaces. So we did a study along an urban gradient, Alsur, Siddhapura, all the way to Talghatpura, which is outside the city. And you find this very interesting thing. There are functioning, thriving markets. Banashankari, for instance, sells so many of these wild species. Various kinds of berike soppus, these leafy greens. You make soppu saru, you make all kinds of various kinds of cooking, you cook with these. And this is good for joint pain. That one is good for your throat pain. This one is really good for your brain. People know a lot of these things. So women are actually told, there are women who sit in Banashankari market are told by their customers, I want 2 kilos of this soppu. Next week, they're back having foraged for it. And if you look at Talghatpura, the average woman, there's always women who are foraging for this, in a low-income settlement will take somewhere from 4 to 8 kgs of these soppus of various kinds a year, all from wild spaces. If you go to Alsur, it's zero. The older women know how to do it, but the younger ones don't, because they say all the places are dirty or they're thrown out of them. They used to collect in Lalbagh near Siddhapura, but now they're not allowed to pluck from Lalbagh anymore. Or they used to go near Alsur Lake, but Alsur Lake is now full of sewage, so you don't want to pluck that and cook with that stuff anymore. So there's so much, if you're looking at nutrition, knowledge about wildlife, there's so much in there, a culture, a way of thinking, and these urban markets that are flourishing in places like Banashankari. We were simply amazed by the stories that, these women recipes they were willing to share. So I think, again, wild spaces support a lot of people. They're just invisible to people like us. And that's really important. You talk to any lake community that is managing lakes, they will tell you that the fishers are the best allies for them, because the moment sewage comes into the lake, it's the fishers who are staying there at night which will help to clean up the lake and block the sewage inflow, because they need the fish to thrive. So they're a natural ally with you. But our policy is focused on the fact that we should ban fishing from lake. Grazing. If cows come and graze at the lake, then that grass is harvesting all these nutrients that come from the sewage. So because you have the grass growing and the cows that are there, you have much less of these water weeds, and you don't have a situation like you have in Bengaluru Lake.
So, in that sense, the way we think about wildlife conservation, in the forests as these guarded sanctuaries or national reserves where no humans should be allowed to enter, we perhaps have that same elite conception of what conservation is even in our cities, right? So, if there is nature, it should be untouched, it should be pristine, no human should do anything to it. Whereas, perhaps a better way to think about it is no, there are things that we can do and we should do, and we can live along with them in various interesting ways.
Exactly. And this is the way these cities have been functioning. I mean, if you looked at the communities around lakes, they were fishing and they were grazing, and all of that supported the lake.
And all of that provides, like you said, the right incentives for these systems to be maintained.
The right incentives and they're part of the ecosystem, no? Like we were talking about the grass. The grass that is harvested by that cow is part of that ecosystem around that lake. So if you pull out the cow, you suddenly have too many nutrients and you have a lake choked with weeds.
Harini, we've been talking about lakes, trees, and our core urban environments, right? But the moment we go just a few kilometers outside the city proper, we get to many national reserves and national parks, which house a lot of large wildlife as well. Near Bangalore, we have the Bannerghatta National Park and a lot of protected regions. How should we be thinking about these protected regions which are necessary for certain critical wildlife? We are seeing Bannerghatta's zone shrinking. We are seeing similar challenges around Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi, pretty much everywhere in the country. How can they be a part of the city, but again stay separate from the ongoing developmental efforts of roads and expressways and other things?
This is a really important point. I think we were doing this nationwide study. And what we're seeing is, if you look at all the major cities in India, anything with 300,000 people or plus, so an average park and an average city in India are at a median distance of 46 kilometers. That's a day's drive. I mean, that's an hour's drive. So on average, most protected areas in India are close to an hour's drive from some kind of a city. And this is only going to increase in the time to come. So it's not just the big Bannerghatta, Sanjay National Park, but it's just all these small towns that are exploding at the periphery of these protected areas. And how have we always managed India's protected areas? Throw the villages out, keep them as pristine places, as you were saying. Obviously, that strategy will not fly with a city. So how do you deal with it? The way we're dealing with it, if you look at Bannerghatta National Park, is to shrink the zone around the park, which is supposed to act as a buffer between the park and the city, by 100 square kilometers, which is a huge amount. See, what do you have? You have a park authority in terms of planning. And then you have a city authority, which is completely separate from the park authority. So they're each doing their own thing, completely not looking at each other, till somewhere the state government comes in and says, okay, these two are, there's a metro coming close to the park, there's a road coming close to the park, there are real estate developers, let me just shrink the area of the park. So by default, the park authorities get second shrift. And then what do you have? You have elephants coming into the city, you have leopards coming into the city, because where else are they going to go? More worrisome, you have the chance of pandemics coming in, because you're getting into these forest areas and disturbing them and sending the ecosystem processes completely out of whack. So I think we need to again be thinking about that very different. To have this buffer zone that protects the park, and you have to have minimum development of certain kinds. So I don't think, for instance, it's fair to tell farmers not to sell their land, but you can see certain kinds of urban development are possible. A metro right next to the park may not be the best. A large tourist attraction, so something with night lights and again lots of parking, and converting Bannerghatta National Park into a tourist attraction may not be the best thing to do for a tiger park. That thinking we're not doing. We're not matching the city with the park, but we're trying to do this planning in completely separate ways, which means that the city takes over the park. But this is a huge challenge for India. It's not a challenge of one city or two cities. It's a challenge that is actually going to threaten all of our protected areas in the future, given that they are so close to cities.
This also means that people who are living there, who might even own property there, might be farmers there, they might have limited gains from what they own, right? So we have to start imagining payments for ecosystem services or biodiversity services or something, right? Such that the lives and the livelihoods of people who live in these buffer zones can also be rich.
Absolutely. So Nepal did this very interestingly. If you look at the Chitwan National Park, all the villages along the edge of the national park were converted into community forest areas. And the village youth were trained in ecotourism. So now if you go to those areas, they will take you around the park and that village earns the income from the fees. So that village actually is, 15, 20 years has hugely improved over time because they have now really good medical facilities, really good roads, educational places, schools, libraries, because they get all this money from tourism. I mean, you get something out of the whole thing, as you say. Otherwise, it's a raw deal for them.
So we have to reimagine that too. And one question, Harini, I mean, while our podcast has been filled with actually a lot of hope and optimism, I want to come back. Many times when we talk about the environment, the narrative is always one of decline, right? It's one of loss, it's one of things becoming worse. And that is also the reality. How are you seeing initiatives across the world which are trying to reverse this in various cities? And how can we bring some of those ideas back to Bangalore and back to Indian cities?
I'm very hopeful of the fact that this COVID-19 lockdown, I mean, whatever other terrible miseries it has brought on us, has also been able to stimulate some imagination of a different way of life. I think those of us who are fortunate to have a roof over heads, money in the bank, food in our stomachs, are realizing that the sort of pace of life we've had so far is unsustainable. It gives you time to reflect and hear bird song and think of things differently. So if you look at it, a number of cities, Milan is shutting off its entire inner city area to create place for biking and walking. Paris is trying to do pop-up bike lanes, around 6,000 kilometers of pop-up lanes for bikes. So they will have these pop-up lanes and see how people use them. And if they land up using certain lanes, they're going to make that change permanent. But it's not just Paris and Milan, because then the standard refrain is India is different from these cities. It's also Barcelona. It's also, so many other cities. Mexico City is trying to do it. If Mexico City with its crime rate can think of closing off certain areas and making it only walking and biking only and trying to reimagine its city, it's high polluted, extremely dense, very large, then I don't see why Bangalore can't do it. So I think there are certain things we need to learn from these cities and their experiments. Unfortunately, what are we doing? In the lockdown, all we've done is decided to provide all kinds of permissions for environmental destruction. Hubli-Ankola line is the railway line is being cleared. The Bannerghatta eco-sensitive zone will be shrunk by 100 square kilometers. And we have given at least 30 different environmental permissions to put roads and railways and mines and all kinds of industrial areas in protected forests. So I think the Indian imagination is post-COVID lockdown, economy at full steam, which means forest destruction and environmental destruction at full steam. But can we learn from these different cities that are trying to do this? If you look at 100 plus mayors that have come together now in different parts of the world, and these are called C40 mayors. So they're looking at low carbon ways to restore their economies post-COVID. So they're saying that we want to industrialize, we want to grow, we want to have economic growth and development, but we want to do it in a different way that is environment friendly. And like I was saying with the communities, I think a network has strength. So if you have 100 plus cities coming together from different parts of the world, if at least a few Indian cities join such networks, then you really have some potential for change.
Certainly. And here I want to perhaps close our conversation for today, but really open up the conversation in the sense that the World Environment Day will again come and go. We will have this recording. Perhaps there'll be a whole bunch of discussions that happen online on many, many Zoom webinars across the internet. How do we sustain this beyond this year? How do you see this when we come back, perhaps next June 5th? We can actually be proud of having accomplished something.
I think you got to the crux of it. So I've been invited to and said no to, I think, at least 5 webinars. It seems like a complete, this World Environment Day is nice that people are interested in this, but it should not be this one day where you just have a webinar, you feel very happy, you think about the environment, tomorrow you're back to business as usual. Challenge really has been about making these flagship events not one-off, but how do you keep them sustained? Unfortunately, I don't see anything that really sustains these. Is there something that we can do in a sustained way? Like the Million Tree Bengaluru. Harini Nagendra was this forester in Bangalore, had done this massive plantation in the 80s and 90s under the Indra Priyadarshini program. Lakhs of trees across the city. All these beautiful rain trees that you see, all these wooded avenues across so many parts of Bangalore are due to that one man and his large team that accompanied him. Why can't we be doing something like this? So I think really a World Environment Day to me is a time to take stock and to make a pledge of what are we going to do for the whole year.
And of course, it need not happen on this day, but if we actually have programs that are launched by the government, by citizen groups and by others, which can stay the length of the year and beyond, then perhaps we are talking about something meaningful.
Stay the length of the year and beyond. Absolutely.
Harini, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us on BIC Talks and for really opening our minds on how to think about rewilding our cities and the urban environment. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Pavan and Raghu. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.